It really hits you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Professor Thomas Seyfried mentioned a statistic that's hard to ignore. The lifetime risk of getting cancer has gone from 1 in 4 to an expected 1 in 2.
Wow.
Think about that for a second. With so much health information out there, you might be wondering, just like I was, why are these numbers still heading upwards?
It's a deeply important question, and that's precisely what we're diving into today. We're taking a close look at the metabolic side of cancer, drawing from the valuable insights of Dr. Barbara O'Neill and Professor Thomas Seyfried.
Exactly. We've been digging into excerpts from a talk by Dr. O'Neill, where she focuses on how certain foods can help fight cancer, alongside excerpts from an interview with Professor Seyfried, who presents cancer as fundamentally a disease of our metabolism.
Yeah, and what's really interesting for you, the listener, is how these two perspectives, while different, might actually offer complementary pieces of the puzzle.
Right. Our aim with this deep dive is to pull out the most useful, actionable information about diet and lifestyle that could genuinely impact your risk of cancer, both in preventing it and potentially in fighting it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're committed to keeping it straightforward and avoiding unnecessary technical jargon.
Absolutely. Let's try.
Okay, let's start by unpacking Dr. O'Neill's core ideas. Her central belief is that cancer thrives in an environment that's acidic, lacking in oxygen, and fueled by sugar.
Right.
So Dr. O'Neill suggests that if these are the conditions cancer loves, then it makes sense that creating the opposite environment in your body could be a helpful strategy.
What's interesting here is her focus on the body's pH balance. Dr. Neal believes that the level of acidity or alkalinity in our bodies plays a significant role in cancer development.
Okay.
You might remember from science class, the pH scale goes from 0 to 14, right, with 7 is neutral. Below 7 is acidic, and above 7 is alkaline. Dr. O'Neill proposes that a more alkaline environment, so above 7, makes it harder for cancer cells to survive and multiply.
So if that's the case, what practical changes could you make to your diet? That leads us to Dr. O'Neill's recommendations for cancer-fighting foods.
Okay.
First on her list are alkaline grains. She includes things like millet, quinoa, amaranth, spelt, brown rice, and oats.
Familiar stuff.
Yeah, and interestingly, she also points out that these are generally gluten-free. Her thinking is that their alkaline nature helps maintain a less welcoming pH for cancer cells.
Now, if we zoom out a bit, organizations like the American Institute for Cancer Research and the World Cancer Research Fund actually recommend getting at least 90 grams of whole grains every day to lower your risk of cancer, particularly colorectal cancer.
90 grams, okay.
What's key here is the fiber, especially soluble fiber, which acts like food for the good bacteria in your gut. It's a prebiotic.
Yeah, the gut health connection.
Exactly. This helps your immunity, reduces inflammation, and keeps your blood sugar levels steady.
And that steady blood sugar seems really important, especially when we consider what Professor Seyfried talks about later regarding cancer cells' reliance on glucose. Dr. O'Neill also mentions that while gluten itself doesn't directly cause cancer, choosing gluten-free options within these grains can help reduce inflammation, and we know that chronic inflammation can play a role in cancer development.
Sure.
So focusing on these types of whole, unprocessed carbohydrates seems to be a key element in Dr. O'Neill's approach. Professor Seyfried, does this align in any way with your metabolic perspective?
Well, it's an interesting point. While the emphasis on alkalinity differs from the metabolic focus on fuel sources, the recommendation for whole, unprocessed foods resonates.
Okay.
These greens tend to have a lower glycemic load, meaning they don't spike blood sugar as dramatically as refined carbohydrates, which, aligns with the idea of not feeding cancer cells excessive glucose.
That makes sense. Dr. O'Neill also highlights certain legumes as being particularly alkaline forming. Lima beans, lentils, and soy, calling them the best 3.
The best 3, huh?
Yeah. She emphasizes their rich nutrient content, which lines up with the AICR's findings that eating legumes like lentils can indeed lower cancer risk. So what makes these particular legumes stand out?
Well, what's interesting about them is their specific components. Lima beans contain protease inhibitors, which are compounds that scientists believe can interfere with the processes cancer cells use to form. Soybeans are rich in isoflavones, which can mimic estrogen and potentially reduce the risk of hormone-sensitive cancers like breast cancer.
Interesting.
And lentils are packed with folate, a B vitamin crucial for healthy cell division. Low levels have been linked to a higher risk of colon and breast cancer.
And Dr. O'Neill suggests there's a benefit to eating these together.
Absolutely. They also provide a good amount of fiber, again, stable blood sugar, and contain saponins, compounds found to have the ability to inhibit cancer cell growth. Consuming these legumes together has been linked to potentially preventing cancers of the breast, prostate, colon, and even lung through various mechanisms like slowing down growth and spread, triggering cancer cell death, that's apoptosis,
Apoptosis, right?
preventing invasion into other tissues, regulating blood sugar, reducing inflammation, and even binding to substances that can cause cancer carcinogens.
Wow, quite a list of benefits. Next on Dr. O'Neill's list are lemons. She really emphasizes how rich they are in alkaline minerals like sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and iron. Almost like these minerals are the gears that keep our body's pH in balance.
What's noteworthy here are the specific roles these minerals play. Lemons actually have more potassium than apples or grapes, which is vital for healthy blood pressure and heart function. But it also helps regulate blood sugar by encouraging the body to produce insulin.
I didn't know that about potassium in lemons.
Yeah, and the magnesium in lemons helps manage our stress response, which is important because, chronic stress can weaken our immune defenses. And the calcium in lemons aids in the absorption of vitamin D, which Dr. O'Neill mentions is linked to a lower cancer risk by helping cells grow and differentiate properly.
And she also talks about the high level of antioxidants in lemons, especially a compound called limone.
Yes, limone, which is found in high concentrations in lemon peel and juice, has been studied quite a bit for its potential to fight cancer.
Okay.
Research suggests it can help prevent cancer cells from spreading, trigger their self-destruction apoptosis, again, make conventional cancer treatments more effective, and protect healthy cells from damage caused by unstable molecules called free radicals.
So it does a lot.
It seems so. This could be particularly beneficial against cancers of the colon, breast, lung, and stomach. Dr. O'Neill also touches on how sunlight, cholesterol, vitamin D production, and the calcium we get partly from lemons are all interconnected.
Interesting connections there.
So after these alkaline grains and legumes, what other dietary strategies does Dr. O'Neill emphasize that contribute to this internal environment?
Well, she then moves on to nuts, specifically mentioning almonds and Brazil nuts, but also noting that seeds in general have an alkaline effect. We should probably include other nuts like walnuts and pistachios in this category too for our listeners.
Definitely. Nuts are packed with goodness, including healthy fats, fiber, and protein, which again helps keep blood sugar stable, something we've already discussed as potentially unfavorable for cancer cells.
Right, that stable blood sugar theme again.
And they're also loaded with antioxidants that protect our cells from damage. For instance, walnuts contain an antioxidant called gamma-tocopherol, which has been linked to a lower risk of breast cancer. The AICR has actually found that eating just an ounce of nuts a day can significantly reduce your overall cancer risk by about 15%.
15%, that's a pretty significant reduction.
It really is. This is partly due to antioxidants like vitamin E and selenium, which fight free radical damage, and various plant compounds called phytochemicals, such as flavonoids and phenolic acids, which have been shown to slow down cancer cell growth and reduce inflammation.
Inflammation again.
Yeah, it keeps coming up. Nuts, especially walnuts, are also rich in omega-3 fatty acids, which are known for their anti-inflammatory effects, crucial since inflammation is linked to many types of cancer.
Right.
These omega-3s can be converted by the body into substances called resolvins and protectins, and they can even interfere with cancer cell growth by activating certain proteins in the cells.
Lastly, from Dr. O'Neill are dark green leafy vegetables, kale, parsley, collard greens, spinach, and silver beet, or chard.
The good stuff.
Yeah, she recommends eating these every day because they are alkaline forming and packed with nutrients.
It's also important to point out that these greens support healthy digestion and regular bowel movements, which can reduce the risk of constipation and diverticulitis, conditions that have been linked to a higher risk of colorectal cancer.
Good point.
So yeah, Dr. O'Neill offers a pretty comprehensive set of dietary recommendations focused on creating an internal environment that is alkaline, well-oxygenated, and low in sugar.
Now let's switch gears and explore Professor Seyfried's perspective. He presents a really thought-provoking view, suggesting that cancer is primarily a metabolic disease, rooted in a problem with how our cells produce energy, what's known as mitochondrial dysfunction.
The powerhouses.
Exactly. Professor Seyfried challenges the traditional idea that cancer is solely a genetic issue, proposing the problems with how your cells generate energy might be a core issue you need to understand.
It's a big shift in thinking for many.
So Professor Seyfried isn't saying sugar causes cancer directly, but more that it creates an environment where cancer is more likely to thrive. Is that fair?
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
His primary focus isn't on specific foods being inherently carcinogenic, but rather on how our overall metabolic state, influenced largely by diet, can either fuel or hinder cancer development.
Okay.
He shares that striking observation from his time in medical school. Cancer rates were around 1 in 4 then, and now they're expected to be 1 in 2.
It's staggering.
It is. He contrasts this sharp increase with the rarity of cancer in ancestral populations who followed traditional diets and lifestyles. He links this rise to the typical Western diet, which is, high in carbohydrates, combined with less physical activity and increased exposure to environmental toxins.
Right.
It's interesting how he draws connections between obesity, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and even Alzheimer's, suggesting a shared underlying metabolic disruption.
It really makes you think about how interconnected these chronic health issues might be.
Absolutely. Professor Seyfried emphasizes the concept of metabolic homeostasis, which is essentially the state of proper balance and functioning of our cells.
Okay, homeostasis.
He argues that various factors in our modern environment, diet and lifestyle, disrupt this balance. What he highlights is the crucial role of mitochondria. These are like the tiny powerhouses within our cells responsible for generating energy and maintaining this homeostasis.
And mitochondrial dysfunction. That just means problems with these powerhouses.
Exactly. According to Professor Seyfried, mitochondrial dysfunction can lead to a range of chronic diseases, and he argues that it's a fundamental issue in cancer.
Okay.
He points out that in virtually every major type of cancer that's been studied, there are defects in the mitochondria. They might be fewer in number, structurally abnormal, or simply not functioning correctly.
Right.
This forces the cell to revert to a more primitive way of producing energy called fermentation, which doesn't require oxygen. And this switch to fermentation, he argues, fuels the uncontrolled growth that we see in cancer.
He also mentions the very low rates of cancer seen in some indigenous populations.
Yes, he refers to the findings of Albert Schweitzer, who studied over 40,000 Africans living traditional lives and found cancer to be incredibly rare.
Wow.
Similar observations were made in Inuit populations before they adopted Western diets, after which they experienced a significant increase in chronic diseases, including cancer.
That's telling.
Yeah. Professor Seyfried believes that our bodies are naturally resistant to cancer when we maintain the right diet and lifestyle, pointing to studies where monkeys on their natural diet were resistant to carcinogens. He even suggests a hypothetical experiment, exposing monkeys to carcinogens while they're on a high-carbohydrate diet to see if their susceptibility changes.
That really highlights the potential impact of diet. He also mentions that cancer seems to develop over time, much like type 2 diabetes.
Precisely. He talks about what's known as the oncogenic paradox, the fact that so many different things like chemicals, viruses, radiation, and chronic inflammation can trigger cancer.
Right, it's confusing.
He believes the common thread linking these diverse triggers is a chronic disruption of energy metabolism within the cell's mitochondria, which then leads to that compensatory shift to fermentation. This brings us back to the early work of Otto Warburg.
Warburg. Tell us a bit more about his observations.
Interestingly, Otto Warburg first observed that cancer seems to arise from damage to a cell's ability to produce energy using oxygen, a process called oxidative phosphorylation.
Okay. Oxfus.
Yeah, oxfus. This is a very efficient way to generate energy, producing a lot of ATP, which is like the cell's energy currency, with carbon dioxide and water as byproducts.
Right, the clean burn.
Exactly. In contrast, fermentation is a much less efficient way to produce energy without using oxygen. It's a more primitive pathway.
Got it.
Professor Seyfried explains that when oxidative phosphorylation is chronically disrupted, it forces cancer cells to rely on this fermentation process. He also points out that mitochondria play a role in controlling the cell cycle, so when they're not functioning correctly, it can lead to uncontrolled cell division.
So it affects growth control too.
Yeah. Cancer cells, he emphasizes, have the ability to survive even without oxygen anaerobiosis and will continue to ferment even when oxygen is available. That's the Warburg effect.
So while Warburg initially focused on glucose fermentation.
Exactly. We now know that cancer cells also ferment the amino acid glutamine. So glucose and glutamine are the primary fuels that cancer cells use for this fermentation, driving their growth and proliferation.
Okay, glucose and glutamine. The bad guys? Sort of?
In this context, yes. But here's a crucial point that Professor Seyfried makes. Fatty acids and ketone bodies are fuels that normal cells with healthy mitochondria can use efficiently, but cancer cells that rely on fermentation cannot.
Ah, that's the key difference.
That's his core argument. His simple idea, as he puts it, is to simultaneously target the fuels for fermentation glucose and glutamine while shifting the body to use these non-fermentable fuels, ketones, and fatty acids.
It's almost like a basic principle. If cancer cells thrive on glucose and glutamine, we should try to limit those while providing alternative fuels they can't use well.
Precisely. Like he says, even a child could understand that. While reducing glucose intake through diet is a relatively straightforward approach, targeting glutamine is more complex because it plays many essential roles in the body.
Right. Can't just eliminate it.
No. This is where Professor Seyfried introduces a strategy called press pulse therapy, which involves creating a very low glucose, high ketone environment, often through a ketogenic diet, that's the press, combined with pulsed administration of drugs that target the glutamine pathway, that's the pulse.
Press pulse, okay. He also draws a comparison to anaerobic exercise, like sprinting. How does that fit in?
Well, what's interesting is that during intense exercise like sprinting, our muscles may not get enough oxygen, so they switch to anaerobic metabolism for short periods, leading to a buildup of lactic acid.
Feel the burn.
Exactly. Afterwards, with rest and increased oxygen intake, the muscle recovers. He explains something called the Cori cycle, where the liver can convert this lactic acid back into glucose. However, muscle cells tend to hold on to their glucose stores. The liver, on the other hand, shares its stored glucose, glycogen, primarily with the brain. After about 36 hours of fasting, when these glycogen stores are depleted, the body starts producing ketone bodies from fat, which the brain can then use for energy.
The body adapts?
Yes. The key difference, Professor Seyfried emphasizes, is that normal cells have this metabolic flexibility to use different fuel sources, whereas cancer cells are much more limited in their reliance on fermentation. They're metabolically inflexible.
So cancer cells are essentially going back to a more primitive way of getting energy, like ancient single-celled organisms.
Exactly. They're using fermentation, which is similar to how single-celled organisms produced energy before there was much oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere.
Wow.
While those early cells weren't cancer cells in the way we understand them, they shared that characteristic of unregulated growth fueled by fermentation. The parallel is quite striking. Cancer cells thrive as long as they have access to fermentable fuels, and they tend to struggle and die when those fuels are severely restricted.
Makes sense.
Even under a microscope, cancer cells often have a more basic, less differentiated appearance. He also briefly touches on the symbiotic event in evolutionary history that led to the development of mitochondria within cells, a huge leap for life. And he points out that cancer cells are, in a sense, misusing these ancient metabolic pathways for their uncontrolled growth.
Fascinating perspective. Now, you've likely heard a lot about the genetic basis of cancer. Let's explore Professor Seyfried's perspective on this, because it's quite different.
Right. He summarizes the somatic mutation theory, which is the prevailing view that cancer is fundamentally a genetic disease caused by mutations in genes that either suppress tumor growth or promoted tumor suppressor genes and proto-oncogenes.
The standard view?
Yes. He acknowledges that inherited mutations, like those in the BRCA1 gene or the P53 gene, as seen in Li-Fraumeni syndrome, can significantly increase a person's risk of developing cancer.
Sure, we hear about those.
However, Professor Seyfried argues that these inherited predispositions are more like secondary risk factors because, in his view, they often lead to disruptions in mitochondrial function, specifically oxidative phosphorylation.
Ah, so even the genes link back to the mitochondria.
That's his argument. He emphasizes that no inherited genetic mutation has a 100% guarantee of causing a particular cancer. There's always variability.
So in his view, where do the genetic mutations that we find in cancer cells actually come from, the ones that aren't inherited?
Professor Seyfried proposes that the genetic mutations we see in cancer cells, known as somatic mutations because they're acquired during a person's lifetime in their body cells, are actually a consequence, what he calls downstream epiphenomena of damaged energy metabolism in the mitochondria.
Downstream effects.
Okay. He explains that when mitochondria aren't functioning properly, they produce more harmful byproducts called reactive oxygen species, or ROS.
Free radicals.
Exactly, free radicals. And these ROS can damage DNA, leading to mutations. Additionally, the acidic environment that's created by fermentation within the tumor can further damage the nuclear genome, the DNA in the cell's nucleus.
So the metabolic chaos causes the genetic chaos.
That's the crux of his argument. So, while we often think of cancer as being driven by genetic mutations, Professor Seyfried suggests that the underlying problem is metabolic, and the genetic changes are often a result of that. This is quite a different way of looking at it.
Definitely. He even touches on prophylactic surgeries that some people undergo based on the presence of certain gene mutations, like BRCA.
Yes, that's a significant intervention and a very personal decision.
Absolutely.
While acknowledging that these genes increase the likelihood of developing cancer, Professor Seyfried doesn't see them as a guaranteed outcome. He believes that maintaining healthy mitochondria through practices like exercise and perhaps achieving ketogenesis can significantly reduce cancer risk, even in individuals who carry these predisposing genes.
It's not predetermined.
That's his view. He uses the analogy of informed consent, arguing that it's crucial for patients to be informed about metabolic therapies as a potential option alongside conventional treatments. He briefly mentions the long history of using ketogenic diets to manage epilepsy, decades actually, and its more recent resurgence in scientific interest for other conditions.
Right. It's not totally new.
Not at all. He shares his own early research and his lab's findings showing that ketogenic diets can impact angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels that feed tumors, and even directly kill cancer cells in animal models.
Interesting results in labs.
Yes, but he also points out the challenges of conducting large-scale clinical trials for metabolic therapies in cancer, despite what he sees as a strong scientific rationale. Funding, bias.
Yeah.
It's complex.
Yeah, the system isn't really set up for it. One question many might have is whether all cancers, despite arising in different parts of the body and being classified into different pathological types, are fundamentally the same from a metabolic standpoint.
That's a key question, absolutely.
Because they look so different.
Yeah, they do. But Professor Seyfried argues that while the specific genetic profiles of different cancers might vary wildly, all major types of cancer rely heavily on the fermentation of glucose and glutamine due to underlying abnormalities in their mitochondria in terms of their number, structure, and how well they function.
So the underlying engine problem is the same.
That's his position. He suggests that metabolically they are very similar and therefore could potentially respond to a unified strategy of metabolic therapy that targets this shared reliance on fermentation.
A unifying theory, almost.
In a metabolic sense, yes. He also discusses the broader health benefits of ketone bodies, the byproducts of fat metabolism that are elevated on a ketogenic diet.
Yes, we hear about ketones in other contexts, too, like for brain health or weight loss.
Exactly. What's interesting is that beyond their potential role in cancer management, ketones have shown promise in treating neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, some mental health disorders, and in promoting weight loss. Professor Seyfried connects this back to the Paleolithic era diet, where periods of therapeutic ketosis were likely common due to food availability and the relative rarity of these chronic diseases at that time.
Makes you wonder.
It does. He emphasizes that it's not just any low-carb diet, but achieving and maintaining a state of therapeutic ketosis that's key. And he cautions that many diets marketed as keto might not be implemented correctly to achieve this. You really need low glucose and elevated ketones.
Right, it requires some precision. This brings us to the interplay between ketogenic and plant-based diets and the anecdotal reports of success that some people have with both approaches in managing cancer. We do hear those stories.
We do. Professor Seyfried acknowledges these reports, referencing books like Kelly Turner's Radical Remission and documentaries like Cancer Revolution, which highlight individuals who have had unexpected recoveries, often involving significant dietary and lifestyle changes.
So what's his take on that?
His perspective is that because cancer cells are already metabolically compromised, making radical shifts in the body's overall physiology through diet and lifestyle can sometimes create an environment that is so unfavorable that it overwhelms the cancer cells. It disrupts their fragile existence.
Like shocking the system.
Kind of. He then introduces a more quantifiable way to assess metabolic status, the glucose-ketone index, or GKI.
GKI. Okay, tell us about that.
This is a ratio of your blood glucose to your blood ketone levels. You measure both, do a simple calculation. He suggests a target GKI of 2.0 or below for cancer management.
2.0 or below. How do you measure it?
He explains that you can measure both glucose and ketones using a device like a keto mojometer, which uses finger prick blood samples. Pretty accessible these days.
Okay.
He notes that the average person's GKI is typically around 50, maybe higher, which indicates a much higher reliance on glucose.
50 versus 2. Big difference.
Huge difference. Achieving therapeutic ketosis and a lower GKI often involves practices like therapeutic fasting and very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets.
So these radical environmental and lifestyle changes can be impactful, especially when cancer is diagnosed early.
That makes sense, changing the terrain when the problem is smaller, right?
Exactly. When diagnosed early, these significant shifts can really alter the environment that the cancer thrives in.
Mm.
However, it often becomes more challenging when patients turn to metabolic therapies only after they've gone through multiple rounds of conventional treatments,
Mm-hmm.
treatments that may have weakened their bodies. Professor Seyfried advocates for considering metabolic therapies earlier in the treatment process, maybe even strategically combining them with lower doses of conventional therapies.
An integrative approach.
Potentially. Now, there's definitely a degree of controversy and skepticism surrounding metabolic therapies for cancer within the mainstream medical community. That's fair to say, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not widely accepted yet. One common concern that comes up is weight loss.
That's understandable, as significant weight loss can be really concerning in cancer patients. Cachexia is a serious problem.
Professor Seyfried makes a crucial distinction here. He differentiates between pathological weight loss, which is cachexia, that wasting syndrome often caused by the cancer itself, or by toxic treatments and therapeutic weight loss, which can occur during fasting, or a ketogenic diet as the body shifts its metabolism and potentially becomes healthier overall, burning fat for fuel.
So losing weight isn't always bad in this context.
Not necessarily, according to him. He points out that the medical establishment often doesn't fully recognize this difference, seeing all weight loss in a cancer patient as negative. He strongly believes in the importance of informing cancer patients about all available options, including metabolic approaches, so they can make truly informed decisions.
Right, informed consent again.
Yeah. He shares an anecdote about an oncologist dismissively referring to the no sugar thing, highlighting what he sees as a profound lack of awareness about the underlying science. He also mentions the Mayo Clinic's stance, at least at one point, on denying a significant role for sugar in glioblastoma, despite scientific evidence suggesting otherwise. He contrasts this with the remarkable case of Pablo Kelly from Devon, England.
Oh yeah, tell us about him.
He apparently survived glioblastoma, very aggressive brain cancer, for almost 9 years using metabolic therapy alone after being given a very poor prognosis. Just months.
9 years. That's incredible for glioblastoma.
It really is. He also points out the lack of significant progress in improving survival rates for glioblastoma over the past century and suggests that radiation therapy, by potentially creating a glucose-rich microenvironment from damaged tissue, might even inadvertently contribute to the problem in some cases.
That's a heavy thought. He also touches on the crucial point of sugar's role in cancer prevention versus its role in treatment once cancer has developed.
That's an important distinction to make, yeah, because people get confused.
They do.
Professor Seyfried clarifies that while sugar itself isn't classified as a direct carcinogen in the traditional sense, like asbestos or radiation, its excessive consumption contributes to systemic inflammation and obesity, both of which are well-established major risk factors for developing various types of cancer.
So it fuels the fire, even if it doesn't start it.
That's a good analogy. He explains the link between high carbohydrate diets, obesity, elevated blood sugar levels, insulin resistance, and accelerated tumor growth. He emphasizes the importance of moderation in consuming processed carbohydrates for overall health and reducing cancer risk.
Makes sense for general health anyway.
Absolutely. He also acknowledges the significant societal challenges related to food deserts, where accessing healthy food is difficult, and the powerful influence of the food industry on dietary habits. It's not always easy for people to make these changes.
No, it's not. So to summarize Professor Seyfried's perspective, what are his key recommendations for reducing cancer risk? What are his top takeaways for our listeners?
His primary recommendations are pretty straightforward. Regular exercise, which helps increase oxygenation and blood flow throughout the body, reducing the intake of high carbohydrate foods, especially processed ones, and occasionally monitoring your glucose ketone index, your GKI, to get a sense of your metabolic state.
Exercise, lower carbs, check your GKI sometimes.
Basically, yes. He emphasizes that these actions can also be beneficial in preventing other chronic metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes and maybe even Alzheimer's. He also briefly mentions the importance of getting adequate sleep and managing stress as additional important factors for overall health and cancer risk reduction.
Right, the whole lifestyle picture.
Mm-hmm.
So to bring it all together for you listening, we've taken a deep dive into Dr. O'Neill's focus on alkalizing the body through specific dietary choices, and Professor Seyfried's compelling argument that cancer is fundamentally a metabolic disease stemming from mitochondrial dysfunction. What's really striking is that both of these perspectives, while approaching the issue from different angles, seem to underscore the powerful role that diet and lifestyle can play in influencing your risk of cancer.
It really does. And this raises a significant question for you to consider. How might this information be relevant to your own personal health journey?
Mhm.
We encourage you to explore the concepts of body pH and the potential benefits of incorporating more whole, unprocessed foods into your diet, like Dr. O'Neill suggests, and perhaps even to look into the glucose ketone index, the GKI Seyfried talks about, as a way to understand your own metabolic health.
We realize that this has been a lot of information to take in, and some of these ideas might be new or even challenge what you've heard before, but it really highlights the importance of being a continuous learner and, exploring different perspectives when it comes to your health and well-being.
Absolutely. This leads us to a final thought for you to ponder. Knowing that the way your cells produce energy could be so fundamental to the development and progression of cancer, as Professor Seyfried suggests, what other aspects of your daily life, maybe things we haven't even touched on, might be influencing this delicate metabolic balance in ways that you haven't yet considered?
That's a great question to leave people with. And this feels like just the beginning of a fascinating conversation. We're already thinking about a potential follow-up, maybe a part two, where we could delve even deeper into topics like intermittent hypoxia and other intriguing aspects of metabolic health.
Sounds good. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it has provided you with some valuable insights to consider.
Thanks, everyone.